So now we want to talk about insurgency and counterinsurgency. And in some respects, this follows on from our discussion of terrorism because insurgency has some things in common with terrorism, but it is distinct, and counterinsurgency strategies are also distinct. And so I want to focus on them. This is especially important for the United States, of course, because we've been facing insurgencies in Iraq for many years now, and in Afghanistan, and there's some signs that this may be the kind of conflict we're most involved with in the future. We'll have to see if that's what the future holds. So what's insurgency? Well, a standard definition is that it's a rebellion against recognized authority. But here we're talking about something more specific. We're actually talking about insurgency as a set of tactics for contesting a violent conflict. It's a way of fighting a war. And sometimes a synonym for it is what's called guerrilla warfare. And again, it gets to this question of what do you do when you're faced with vastly superior force? And just to give you some cases, right? Think about the areas that the Nazis had occupied during World War II in France or in parts of the Soviet Union. If you wanted to push back against the Nazis after they'd already defeated your army and your army was somewhere else, what do? You can't just go out in the streets and fight them. Afghanis resisting Soviet occupation in the 1980s and 90s. In the 1980s, or then the U.S. Intervention after 2001. Similar to the Iraqis. FARC rebels in Colombia. There are many, many cases of this. That's really all the point that I'm trying to get across. So what's the strategy of insurgency? It is to raise the costs of the occupation, right? That's the basic idea, is raise the cost high enough so whoever it is decides it's not worth it and they're just going to leave you alone. Part of raising the cost then is to force the occupier to do things that reduce its legitimacy, right? Do things where if they want to stop you, they've got to do terrible, horrible things like burning down whole villages or restricting freedom of the press that essentially, right, puts the occupier in a position of having to make themselves less popular because of the things they're doing to you. The flip side of that is build support among the population. And this is really important, convince the population that you'll outlast the occupier, right? You're using violence, the occupier is using violence. Lots of people basically are going to not want to get either of you mad, but in particular, what people want to do is make sure that when the dust settles, right, that whoever it is that's actually now running the country does not want to come kill them. And so convincing people that eventually you're going to be the one that prevails is an important way at a minimum of keeping people from siding with your adversary, but at a maximum maybe of getting them to join with you. Perceptions of who's likely to succeed create this bandwagoning effect. So what are the tactics? Well, again, similar to terrorism, the idea is avoid direct battle, right? The forces you're fighting against have more people, they have better weapons, they're better organized, and so on. So you choose where and when you're going to engage, right? And you do so in a way that inflicts casualties and disrupts economics. So what does that mean? It means you, rather than going into direct battle, you try to ambush. You ambush, you kill a bunch of people, and then you get away before they're allowed to kill any of you. You disrupt economics, right? You blow up rail lines, you blow up factories, you cut electrical wires, these kinds of things. So you simply make the occupier's life more difficult and make it very difficult for the occupier to say to all the civilian population, see where we can protect you and we can make your life normal. You also have to punish collaboration, and that's where some of the worst sort of brutality comes in, which is finding local people who collaborate with the occupiers and doing horrible things to them so that others are deterred from doing that. And a really important part of insurgency is blurring the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. This is especially important for intelligence gathering. So many insurgents, right, you may be a school teacher or a factory worker by day, but while you're doing those things, you're keeping your eye out for where troops are moving, you're listening for things that are going on, passing on intelligence, right? In particular, in Iraq and Afghanistan, one of the things U.S. forces found is they could never really surprise anybody because there were these informal networks that were always telling people, oh, the Americans left their base, they're headed in this direction. Or even, right, people who were working for the Americans were actually spying on the Americans and telling others about the plans. So basically, the idea is there are people who are helping the insurgency that nobody could identify ever as members of the insurgency. So the flip side is, what are the keys to counterinsurgency? And the single biggest thing that people harp on over and over again is this phrase, hearts and minds. Because the sort of the strategic center of the conflict is the civilian population, they have to want you to win, right? If the population wants the occupying authority to prevail because they regard the others just as criminals, then they can begin to tell you where the insurgents are, right? They can begin to warn you about insurgent attacks rather than the other way around. And this makes it easier for you to kill the insurgents. Another big part of it, just to turn this around, is commitment. When you're occupying some foreign country and there's an insurgency that you're fighting against, the insurgents are going to convince people. It's like, sooner or later the Americans are going to leave. And when they do, you're going to be left dealing with us. So who do you want to side with? So one of the real challenges for an occupying authority or an occupying power is to convince people that they're in it for the long haul. There's an interesting argument that came from Stanley McChrystal, who was the U.S. the U.S. commander of forces in Afghanistan for a while. And he basically raised this question because he was pushing back against this idea that what you needed to do was go out and kill the insurgents. In his way, and I'm paraphrasing his example, you have 10 insurgents, right, and you kill 2. How many are left? It sounds like a second-grade math problem. Well, the standard answer is if you have 10 insurgents and you kill 2, then you have 8 left. And McChrystal's point is, well, maybe not. Right? McChrystal said if you kill 2 insurgents and every one of them has 10 friends and cousins, then instead of being down to 8, you're now up to 28 insurgents because there's all those other people that now hate you because you've killed their friend or their cousin or whatever. And regardless of what the math actually is, the point is that sometimes, even when it seems like you're winning an insurgency, you may not be. Unless what you're doing is seen as legitimate, then your victories may even prove to be losses. So the key question in an insurgency oftentimes is this competition over which 2 sides are more sensitive to casualties, and an occupying force is almost always more sensitive than a country that's being occupied. How does the population respond to violence to the 2 sides? One of the problems for the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan is whenever we killed somebody, we were seen as having done something horrible. So people saw that as a reason to join the other side. And when the insurgents would go blow up a bunch of innocent people, that was seen as bad, but it was kind of seen as, well, that's because they're fighting the Americans. And so this asymmetry in the way that responsibility was assigned was just always working against the United States. And then there's this key point that I think is really important as well, which is oftentimes the strategic center of gravity is not in the country that's being occupied where the insurgency is going on, but it's in the country that's doing the occupying. Basically being the idea of how long will the people of the United States, right, continue supporting the Vietnam War? How long will they continue supporting sending people to Afghanistan and Iraq? The argument is that that's the strategic center of gravity, and that's the thing that's most likely to give out first. And so that leads into a whole bunch of other issues.